Now to Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna has become legendary for his investigations into psychedelic mushrooms, virtual reality, UFOs, evolution, the rebirth of the goddess, and the end of history. His numerous books include the recent Archaic Revival and Food of the Gods, The Search for the Original Tree of Knowledge, and Trialogues with Rupert Sheldrake and Ralph Abraham. Terence McKenna is a scholar and brilliant interdimensional adventurer with an understanding of nature from the depths of the Amazon to the most current scientific breakthroughs. He is a shamanologist who traverses the worlds of the psyche and the spirit, bringing back startling visions of the revelatory nature of existence. Simply put, he takes enormous chances, breaks all the rules, and comes back with pearls. Welcome Terence McKenna, Imagination in the Light of Nature.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I've heard of preaching to the choir, but this is absurd. Out of deference to where we're meeting, I'll try to curb my anti-clerical tendencies for the next hour anyway. Before I get into this, I'd like to thank a number of people associated with Earth Trust. Andrew, Matthew, Georgianne, Elizabeth, they're the people who put this event together. Jim Essex is handling security tonight, and we appreciate that. My goodness, a balcony as well. All the usual suspects appear to have been herded into one room. That was a wonderful introduction from Georgianne. I'd love to meet that guy sometime. I accepted this invitation to speak because I think what the Earth Trust Foundation is doing is not only very important, but I also perceive the potential for a pun in their name, and I'll talk about that a little this evening. I think we're living through extraordinary times, even more extraordinary than usual over the past couple of years. I think you have to be fairly lumpen indeed to not feel the flux, the change that is cascading into the historical process at this time. Bifurcations, opportunities for choice are opening up all around us, and yet it's a kind of coincidentia positorum. There's also great risk, great anguish, great uncertainty about where we as a species and as a planet are headed. And I certainly don't have any final answers, but I think that we can talk about these things and build a sense of community and a sense of direction that is capable of overcoming some of the paralysis that has characterized the last couple of decades. Because as we move closer and closer to the millennium, it's becoming clearer and clearer, to me at least, and I would like to try and convince you of the fact that 10,000 years of human history, of the human adventure, are coming to a kind of culmination in our lifetimes. This is the make or break decade, this and the decade which will follow it. The human enterprise has grown from an enterprise confined to one primate species isolated on the grasslands of Africa to an enterprise which now echoes and re-echoes in the life of every organism on the planet. We have, for better or ill, seized the tiller of planetary development, seized the tiller of human history. And the question is, whither are we headed? Where do we want to take the human adventure? And I think we've been preparing for this culmination for a long, long time. I see human history as essentially an unconscious but unerring movement toward something. And the question is, what? Is it simply that we have been preparing to commit suicide with greater and greater efficiency for 15,000 years? If you place your faith in secular politicians and the kind of ideas that are being peddled in the ideological marketplace of the mainstream, you could hardly conclude anything else. But I submit that occluded from our vision, and for very good reasons, is the raison d'etre of this process, human history, and that we are now in a position to raise the veil on what that goal might be. But there will be a number of casualties to this raising of the veil, not least among them science as ordinarily practiced, dominator politics as ordinarily practiced, and the division of our human community into factions defined by race, religion, and class. All of these institutions and styles of the past have now become essentially lethal if we expect to evolve deeper into some kind of humane future. My interest in this, or my awareness of these issues, has grown over the years through an involvement in shamanism. Shamanism that was specifically rooted in the kind of experiences that are induced by psychoactive plants. Now, this is an area that our society is extraordinarily phobic and nervous concerning. And the reason, I think, is not far to seek, because institutions, modern institutions, depend on the transmission of a certain worldview and then willing acquiescence in the truth of that worldview by the populations into which it is being exported. In other words, a kind of cultural brainwashing is necessary for modern cultures to work at all. And the consequences of the acceptance of this situation of brainwashing is further acceleration toward catastrophe. Many people are in anticipation of a kind of apocalypse, a kind of complete breakdown of social institutions and ideals. And I must say to you, the apocalypse is not something which is coming. The apocalypse has arrived in major portions of the planet, and it's only because we live within a bubble of incredible privilege and social insulation that we still have the luxury of anticipating the apocalypse. If you go to Bosnia or Somalia or Peru or much of the third world, then it appears that the apocalypse has already arrived. And I wonder then, what magnitude of responsibility rests upon those of us who still have the luxury of the time and the clarity to think about what can be done to save ourselves, and in so doing save the planet. And the conclusion that I've reached, and it's not easily condensed into a bumper sticker, unfortunately, is that we have to, this is something that I evolved in my own personal life, which is when you lose the thread, when you become confused, the best strategy is to think think back to the last sane moment that you knew and then act from there. And this is an impulse that affects societies as well as human beings. This year we celebrate the 500th anniversary of the discovery of the New World, our world. Now that was a historical event essentially financed by Italian banking families and the spin-offs of their enterprises. They created a world on the wreckage of the collapse of the medieval Christian eschatology based on classicism. And that model has survived and functioned fairly well up into the 20th century. This is a standard impulse within a society, to go back to an earlier time and to create new models and new institutions based on an ever more ancient past. Now our situation is global and extreme. And so when we reach back into the past for a model, we have to pass over Greece. We have to pass over dynastic Egypt. We have to go back to a time before history, before the fall into hierarchical dominance, before city-states, before slavery, before advanced technology, before agriculture. And when we go that far back into time, we discover a world that until very recently was completely incomprehensible to us, a world that it was thought of as primitive, simplistic, childlike, as late as the 1950s, and for many people unto this moment. But careful analysis of these Aboriginal societies leads to the conclusion that history is a dysfunctional state of some sort. History is an act of brutish insensitivity, only achievable through an act of self-limitation from the demands and the inspiration of nature. And I reach these conclusions basically as a rationalist. I think that, and this is based largely on the content of the psychedelic experiences that I have had and that I have had described to me, not only by Aboriginal people, but by people such as yourselves. Apparently there is a great discovery or insight which our culture is deliberately designed to suppress, distort, and ignore. And this is the discovery that nature is some kind of minded entity, that nature is not simply, the random flight of atoms through electromagnetic fields. Nature is not the empty, despiritualized lumpen matter that we inherit from modern physics, but it is instead a kind of intelligence, a kind of mind. And as long as we were embedded in this mind, as long as we were a part of its purposes and processes, harmony existed on this planet between human beings and the rest of nature, between men and women, between adults and children, and within the human individual. And the reason that this harmony was able to maintain itself for perhaps 25 times the duration of history is because it honored and balanced all the components that created it. Now, in my book, Food of the Gods, I put forth an elaborate reconstruction of evolutionary theory based on the idea that psychedelic compounds, specifically psilocybin, were what kept us in this dynamic balance with the mind behind nature. And I've lectured that often enough to you that I'm going to only indicate it tonight, to your great relief, I'm sure. I've said it often enough that I think we can operate in the light of it as an established possibility or a respectable theory. The question that I'd like to talk to you about tonight is, if that were true, then what does it say for the future? What are we to do? Where are we to seek hope? And what kind of obligation devolves upon each of us? Well, if this is true, that history is a kind of neurosis, a kind of dysfunction based on a broken line of communication into nature, then how can it be repaired? The personal answer is, to my mind, obvious. It's an involvement with Aboriginal peoples and their practices and attitudes. And I'm not talking about drumming here, folks. I'm talking about availing oneself of the pharmacological and psychobotanical doorways that lead into a feeling-toned relationship with the natural mind. This is actually the matrix out of which consciousness was born. We find our way back to it through the judicious use of psychedelic plants. And I think I have made that point enough times that I don't have to repeat myself. What I'd like to talk about tonight is, how do we, a self-defined cultural elite, as much as anybody hanging out in their office in Century City, how do we, the psychedelically informed postmodern neo-shamanic community, move from being a tolerated and somewhat loathsome fringe population to a voice in the dialogue here in anticipation of the end of the world that can be heard? How do we do that? Well, I think that there are a number of possibilities, and I always enjoy making this point in this town particularly, because this is the city of the graven images, not in gold and stone, but in film and light. This is the meme engine of the Western world. Those of you who work in media know the power of the word. As it is said, so shall it be. And so the tool of the revolutionaries at the end of the millennium is, to my mind, art. Art which connects people, which transcends the mundane, and which empowers hope. And, of course, it can have many forms and occur in many media, but it must be true to itself. It must be true to the thing we were before the descent into history. And I don't see history entirely as a pathology. I see it, the story I like, which seems to me to illuminate the situation, is the story of the prodigal son. We, Western civilization, we are the prodigal son. We left the confines of the family of nature, and we made a hellish descent into intellectual limitation, into matter, into model building that was deliberately self-limited. We exorcised the spirit from our model building. We exercised a caring and enfolding matrix of maternal understanding. And what we created were models based on atoms flying through the void. This may have been a necessary precondition to our shedding the theological misconceptions that occurred when male dominance got a hold of the idea of religion. It becomes a lethal idea if practiced too long. models. That's why I use the word model so frequently rather than the concept of truth. I mean, for monkeys to speak of truth is hubris of the highest degree. I mean, where is it writ large that talking monkeys should be able to model the cosmos? If a sea urchin or a raccoon were to propose to you that it had a viable truth about the universe, the absurdity of that assertion would be self-evident. But in our own case, we make an exception. Too bad.